Hi guys, welcome to another Pieandbelle Art class. This week we're going to do this kind of abstract woman's face in scenery. The first thing we're going to do is draw her face out on a piece of paper, watercolour paper, and then we're going to make two lots of ink. That first one I've put one squeeze of water in, and that second one I've put three, and all that is going to make some light grayer inks rather than the black. The back I'm going to use that lighter ink. This ink is Chinese ink, it's just a water soluble ink. You could use any water soluble ink. The most important thing is with the paper, to make sure it's a nice high quality watercolour paper. Once I've got that basic kind of weird backgroundy thing in, I'm going to pad out the whites of her face. So anything I can see that's light, her cheeks and stuff. Because the ink is grey, I can actually see through and see my pencil drawing just underneath. But the thing is, if you go a bit too far, like there, I've gone out of the kind of line of it, you just bring that ink back in. Because it's abstract, it's not supposed to look exactly like a certain scenery. I'm just playing around with it. Now I'm going to bring in the pure ink at the bottom, the darkest area. And you've got a lot of time because the paper's nice and wet, so you can play around with it and kind of go back and forth. I really want to have her eyelashes as a kind of splayed effect. I think I work on them a bit later, but you can see there at the top of her head where things are happening, where it's starting to dry out there. So you'll know areas that you can work on and areas that you can't work on, basically. Now I'm just bringing in lots of that dark ink, because even though it looks black once it's on there, you'll be surprised how many times you can go over this. It will be dark, but it won't be that solid black. It will actually be able to work on top of it in a little while. And what I'm going to do is kind of give her an idea of some eyebrows and an idea of the shade of her nose, and just an idea of her basic face at this point, because we can work on that when it's dry. Now again, once it's dry, it is watercolor paper. You can re-wet and take out. So this is why it's really important to have a high quality watercolour paper, because with things like that little bit beneath her nose where I put in that little bit of her cupid's bow, I'd take that out later because I don't like it. So there is always availability to change things up. And again, when you're doing it, see how dark it goes, see if you like it or don't like it, and just pad it out with the tissue. So I think I actually draw some trees down here in the right, and then I dislike it and I go over it with black. That is the lovely thing with working all in one colour, is that you actually get to kind of, and also kind of making it up as you're going along, as you get to change it. So you can see now it's all dry, you can see how much lighter it's gone. Now I'm going to actually apply water there to her upper lip and take that bit out because I didn't like how that dried out. So that's the thing, you can soften them. Okay, you can't maybe take out the colour entirely, but you can definitely soften it to a much lighter pigment. Again, I'm doing the same with her nose. I'm going to start building up her nostrils and the parts of the shadows of her nose. But again, be very cautious with how much you're putting on and where you're putting on and if you like it or not. Her face, I wanted her eyes and eyebrows to be very loose, and then her nose and mouth to be more obvious so you actually see the face. If I'd have done it all loose like the eyes and eyebrows, I don't think you would actually necessarily see it entirely. So I wanted to have some part of her face more accurate, which is the mouth and nose, and then the eyes just kind of almost like they're part of the scenery. Yeah, so I draw a tree down here, but what I realise is when this black ink dries, it looks fine when it's all dark, but when the black ink dries, you can barely see this tree. It just kind of dries into the ink beneath. So you might come across encounters like this where it's an issue, where you've done something and it doesn't work, but working in black, you can just go over the top of it, so it really doesn't make any difference. I just made that kind of a hillside instead, which you'll see a bit later. So you can always play around with these things. You don't have to leave them as is. Again, it's just a kind of, we're just making it up as we go along really at this time. So I'm using the reference picture to make sure I know where all the shadows are, to create her face and give myself those kind of shapes going on. And this is real fun to play around with. It's just a real fun kind of like picture to have a go at, because you're not copying any reference apart from the face, so you can literally add things wherever you want them. So I start building trees in this side, the same as I did to the right, but the right really just didn't work when it dried. You can already see at the start, at the right hand side of that tree at the bottom right, how it's kind of disappearing into the background, because that is much too heavy, that bottom right section, to put anything in. Again, to give them some grounding, I draw the picture of the trees or whatever I'm putting in, and then I use just plain water underneath them to kind of give them a ground and to soften them into the background. You see there, and if it softens out too much, you just pat it out with the tissue. So now I'm giving her a proper shape of her face, because obviously it dried in a slightly weird kind of haphazard manner, so I'm actually going to build in the shape of her face there too. I do use a fine liner later on to give myself the little fine details going on. But basically you want it to kind of look like she's part of a lake, and then this is some weird scenery in front, so you can really build whatever you want in this. So I kept trying to go over that bit, but it just wasn't happening. And you're just building her face up, putting little tiny bits in. It's surprising how smaller amount of ink you actually need to give yourself a little hint of something like that tiny little dash I put near her chin. Just gives you that kind of impression of her chin coming in there. You don't need a lot. And remember, with watercolour and ink like this, touching in the ink and watercolour at different times will do different effects. So if the paper's really wet, it will splay loads. If the paper's a little bit drier, it will splay less. So don't be afraid to go back to a piece you've put water on and it's started to dry, and then actually add a little bit more ink to that whilst it's in that kind of mid-damp stage, because it will do a completely different effect and it will make it look more interesting. So I'm going to start building her face a little bit more. I'm also going to build a hill here and take out that entire tree, because that totally didn't work, and that's fine. That is the lovely thing about art, is you can just play around with it. You don't have to keep it as is. And I'm going to build a tree on top of this hill. So I'm going to cover up some of that area where I didn't like how it dried. That is the fun of doing something like this, something really random like this. I'm also going to get those branches to go across her face like her hair does. I'm going to build these up more when I have a fine liner as well, and it will kind of give the impression of her hair going across her face like it is in the photo. When doing trees, remember to keep your lines kind of wiggly and not all in the same direction. They go all over the place, branches. So try and keep it kind of as haphazard as you possibly can, and obviously going thicker as it gets towards the bottom. I'm also going to put some kind of foliage on this hill and indicate that this is kind of quite close. Again, it doesn't really matter what you're doing. It doesn't have to make sense in the fact that it looks exactly like a scene, because you're just making it up as you're going along. It's just a fun piece to kind of see how we can do a bit of portraits included into something else. I had a lot of fun doing this. I like doing things where I have no picture reference sometimes. I like having a picture reference for part of it and then using something like this just to kind of have a kind of crazy go at it and see how I can work it. I mean, I really didn't have any idea what this was going to turn out like when I started it. I just kind of thought I'm going to go for it and see what happens. So now I'm starting to build up some foliage on these kind of little hilly areas that I've made. And again, soften it off at the bottom with water and use your tissue to kind of soften it into that ink that's already there. And you know, make sure your trees are all different heights. They don't tend to all grow in unison. It's not a garden, so there'll be like high ones and low ones. It'll just be really random. So I think when you start getting into it a little bit further, you can start to see what you're creating. I kind of wanted to join that onto her eyelash slightly, so that that kind of looked like part of the picture. I think I add another little tree down here, and I think I come in soon with just the fine liner when this is all dry and just incorporate it all together. So once you're happy with how the kind of basic foliage is looking, you can let this all dry so that you've got nice dry canvas to go over with your fine liner. You don't have to use fine liner though, obviously you could just do the whole thing in paint. I think I'm almost done now. So now I've trimmed it down, I've taken off all the excess paper, so it's just absolutely how it's going to be, and now I'm just going to come in with the fine liner. I'm going to bring some of these branches coming down because they look very vertical, so I know that when trees get older their branches tend to kind of start bending down with the weight of them, especially if they're not maintained in a garden and they're wild like this. So I'm going to start bending these tree branches down at the ends. And again, I'm just randomly kind of drawing them out. Just random kind of patterns going outwards. I'm also going to darken in areas I can see that are dark on her lips, give her a little bit of shading around the nostrils. And I think I bring a little bit of kind of element into her eyebrows. It doesn't need a lot because, like I said, I really wanted to keep her eyebrows and eyelashes fairly loose so that they kind of went into the background, and then bring the detail more into her mouth and nose, which is coming more into the foreground. So I think I'd draw a little fence here, just an idea of a little fence going across there because I felt like that looked like fields. And it's just a real fun way, if using one picture as your reference and then just randomly trying to make up a landscape, incorporating that picture in. I felt like a real high contrast picture like this works really well for that, and I think it turned out really interesting. Hope you like that, guys. I will see you soon. Bye.